Welcome to Trailer Rewind. Every month we dig into the archives and view a film that Pete and Andy talked about in their trailer picks. JJ and I watch it and have a very spoilery conversation about it. Today we're looking at Experimenter. This was Pete's pick from October 9th, 2015. Now before we go any farther, you should check out our ever-expanding back catalog for this show and its sibling shows over at thenextreel.com. If you've stumbled upon us, you can subscribe in your favorite podcast app or follow us on Twitter and Facebook at The Next Reel. And whether you've just found us or have been listening for a while, you can be part of our community, supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thenextreel. That's Patreon, Patreon.com. Supporting us gets you into our Slack group where there's always a fun conversation going on. So for Experimenter, Pete was interested in this film due to his interest in Stanley Milgram, and he thought that this looked like an interesting film and noted that it had what he felt was a fantastic cast. He said it was interesting to see the story of a man that it was worth learning about, and although we may not agree with whether his experiments were ethical, right, or good, we could learn a lot about the human condition due to his work. Andy mentioned that he was also intrigued by the cast, especially Jim Gaffigan in this film. So, JJ, did you learn more about yourself or Milgram from this film?
So I knew about the experiments, but I didn't know the name Stanley Milgram. So I didn't know that he was. I knew about the obedience tests, right, which is the sort of fulcrum for the story here. It's the real sort of basis of how he grows into fame or infamy, however you want to look at that. But I didn't know about he also was the originator of the 6 degrees of separation theory and so many other things that really are sort of almost like accepted realities for how we live today. It's almost like some of them have become cliche because they're so bandied about in the world, which I think is great. I was really surprised at the cast too. Surprised is the wrong word. I was really impressed with the cast and the people who signed up for this movie, and it was really interesting. It was really dynamically different than what I expected when I was coming into it. So in general, it was super artful and done in a way that you wouldn't expect for a movie that is really based on a kind of a biography, right? It almost felt like really a fictional or dramatic way to look at something that was nonfiction. But most of the metaphor and the stuff that they were really trying to get in that art just went over my head. It didn't bother me, though, because I found it really artful and I liked it. It didn't teach me stuff about myself, but it did inspire me to do some reading and to learn more, not about the nonfiction stuff, but about the stuff that inspired him. A lot of times you'll see them actually reading in this movie, and it poetically or in a really interesting way inspired him for the social psychology stuff that he was doing. The stuff that it really pointed me towards, though, was the current event stuff. Everything that's going on right now about social movements and the kind of things where people are, whether it's obedience or whether it's the idea of following a flag, and what that means, and doing what the others are doing around you. This stuff is all of a sudden, again, super, super important to really examine in ourselves, and that's what really hit me hard. Especially, talking about specifically this week, and I'm not exactly sure where we're going to release this on the podcast, but the Charlottesville, Virginia events. It's just extremely profound and poignant right now, and that's how it hit me. How about you, Steve?
Oh yeah, I mean, I knew about the obedience experiment, and what the story really does is it takes us from, throughout his career, and we get to see a lot of things. Like I didn't know about the 6 degrees of separation, and just so many other interesting studies on human nature, whether it was having someone stand outside and just look up in the sky to see how many people will start following this behavior just based on social pressures. And we even learned about some of his colleagues and some of their experiments. And it was just a very interesting exploration. To me, it felt almost like a narrated version of a documentary, because it is his story, but it's so rooted in his work that it's a nice sort of overview or synopsis of his career. And it just takes us through that systematically, through these different phases. And we get to see some, aspects of his personal life and how they connect to what's going on. But for me, it was, I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but from early on, it just sets a very specific tone by having him narrate his story, and he will tell us throughout the film, his work and its influence, and how some of these experiments have been recreated, and the results have been proven again and again. That particularly in the obedience experiments, he mentions that it was done on a French game show. Just sort of the cultural influence that his work has had, and how it continues to exist to this day, even though at the time there were. He was really, not welcomed into the community because there were questions about the ethical nature of the obedience experiment, because the people that were actually the subjects weren't aware of their role in the experiment.
How did you feel about that? How do you feel about that question? Because I feel like that question it's central to Stanley Milgram's life, but I also think that they're trying to examine that a little bit in this movie.
Oh, well, it's, anytime you observe something, you influence it. I think he was trying to remove that factor out of an experiment. If someone knows that they are part of an experiment, their behavior, is going to change because they know that their actions are being observed, or the decisions they make are going to be evaluated and judged. I mean, just as with there's, a certain amount of room for unreliability in surveys, because once you ask a person a question, and how truthful will they be when they know that although it's anonymous, are they going to be honest with themselves about what they're going to check on that box when they're in the doctor's office of, how many drinks have you had this week, and how do you smoke cigarettes? Yes or no? How truthful are people in that? And I think that sense of being observed can alter our behaviors. So I think his attempts to do that were purely science driven in terms of, I want to get the most authentic response from people. But it does call into question, what responsibility to have those people, because the situation they were in was a very stressful and, troubling situation that they were put in. It wasn't just that they were asked to do something. They were asked to do something that is pretty horrific.
Well, and there's an irony in that too, right? So as he's being questioned about the ethics or the validity of his survey, the experiment, he actually produces a survey and quotes the statistics. This is when he's up for tenure track.
Yes.
And he quotes the statistics of how people responded to the survey. But I feel like that's truly ironic, because what he learned in the experiment was that people will perform based on how they are supposed to perform. So because they were still in the environment or very freshly out of the environment when they took the survey, the numbers are actually pretty skewed if you think about that. They're still trying to please or do what the experimenters or the gray lab coat guy wants them to do. So it's interesting and ironic that he discovered this piece of obedience, but then tried to defend himself by using numbers that actually could be skewed by that same obedience.
Yes. I mean, it's whenever you are sort of monitoring or testing the limits of, human nature and behavior, you get interesting results. And what I found really interesting in this story was he became so known for, the obedience experiment and just the ethical questions because of how the true nature of the experiment was concealed from the people that took the role of the teacher and had to deliver the electric shocks, that later on in his career, we have a scene where we see him walk into a classroom and he announces that President Kennedy has been shot.
President Kennedy's been shot. He was shot in a motorcade in Dallas. He was shot in the head.
It's Milgram. It's just another one of his experiments.
Yes, yes.
Kelly, you've got that radio, yeah? Turn it on.
During his tour of the city of Dallas, Texas, a presidential aide, Larry O'Brien, said he had no information on whether the president is alive, but later reported...
He's rigged a fake broadcast like Orson Welles.
I have.
I wonder what the experiment's really about.
This is real.
He was in a position where now people would start to question what was real.
Right. And that felt really artful too. That might be anecdotal about Milgram's life. That might have actually happened. But I think it's an interesting choice to put that in the film and then leave basically just a silent sort of walk away. You see Sarsgaard react to it in the class kind of a, oh, what have I done here, right, with human behavior, and then walking away and seeing the effects of Kennedy's assassination on people not associated with the class. But the film just allows you to figure out what your interpretation as a viewer is of that scene. It doesn't really put anything forward saying this affected Milgram in X way or Y way, which I think is interesting. I thought that was a really profound scene too. I would have loved to see more of how that affected him, but I don't think that necessarily that was the nature of this film. I think the artful romanticizing of those moments in his life were really meant to be shown in a dramatic way to say, this is how profoundly he affected the immediate environment around him, and then America as a whole, really the world as a whole, when you talk about social science.
So we've been talking a lot about sort of his experiments, his life. You talked about Sarsgaard and his role. One thing that struck me really is the way this film is set up, because it's not a traditional narrative. There's a lot of breaking that fourth wall where Milgram is addressing the audience. He's narrating his own story. So he's narrating his story. But beyond that, even what I found interesting was the structure of how the film is edited together, because we start with our opening shot is in the lab. A doctor comes in. We see, the introduction to the experiment that most of us have heard of or are slightly familiar with this experiment. Even if we don't know who is involved or what the exact nature was, we know that there was an experiment where people supposedly electrocuted other people because someone told them to. But then we get that interwoven with his meeting with his woman that ultimately he's going to become married to, his wife, who's played by Winona Ryder. But then I started to get this sense that we were in sort of this hyper real setting, because there's one point where they're in the hallway of the university and there's like this elephant just walking in the background. And my wife looks at me and she says, "Is that the elephant in the room?"
Well, in the first time they used it, I think that was definitely clear. The second time they used it, this is where I started getting mixed into the metaphors, where I was like, what are they talking about? And then it was gone.
Right.
And another sort of artful depiction of what was happening in the life came up, so I kind of got lost. That being said, I think that's the only interpretation you can have when you see that. And those kind of, I don't even want to call them plot points. Those kinds of that kind of storytelling is kind of what makes this film special, I think.
Yeah, because I thought, when I was finished with it, as I said earlier, it's sort of like a documentary. It lays out these facts, but it's doing it in a very sort of sterile manner, because I don't feel that I'm being asked to really identify with him. And I think Sarsgaard's performance goes along with that. He's a very cold presentation of this information. And then we get scenes where, and I struggled with, is it because of the era that it was set in, or if this was another stylistic choice of, so we've got Stanley and his wife driving over to, visit some friends, and it's all rear projection, as if it was shot in the, 50s or 60s. They're in the car and it's the projection screens on the sides and the back. I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then they get out of the car and they're standing clearly on a stage next to a car with a big screen behind them projecting the house. And then when we get into the house, it's just them sitting at a dinner table, and there is no house. It's just the screen behind them of a projection of the interior of a house. And I thought, okay, it made sense in the car, because maybe that's of the time to give us a sense of, we're in the, early 60s here. But then I started to question that choice to have an entire scene where they're having a conversation where we're not in a very realistic setting. It's trying to set some type of tone. And I was trying to figure out how I'm supposed to feel about that, or how I'm supposed to interpret why this particular scene is being presented this way.
Right, and that gets into the metaphor of it. And that's the kind of piece where I was lost. But I did appreciate it, because it felt like film as art. I think that those scenes in particular, you're talking about the facade of the background. I think it has to do with perception and reality. And it probably can be traced back to the idea of our own perception of how we would perform in the obedience test, or our perception of how we think the general public would perform, whether or not that's real or not, and how we're actually living through the facade of that. But again, this is me taking a leap because I wasn't able to connect it in the film. I was just able to appreciate the art of what was being presented for me.
Well, I think you touch on the point of perception, because I wondered if it was, is this a way to visually portray this is perhaps Milgram's memory of it, so it's not 100% faithful to reality, because we're getting his construction as he remembers this scene versus what we see in the experiment when we're in the lab, which is we are there. This is a very realistic setting. This is what happened. However, this dinner scene, maybe not 100% real. Maybe this is a scene that had to be constructed together to convey this information. So we're getting something that's less than 100% real.
That's definitely possible. And
So,
I think that that's kind of the beauty of this film. A person who's watching it will appreciate it if it, I mean, when you first think of the subject matter, you don't think this film is going to be very deep. You don't think that it's going to take that sort of dramatic view of this. It looks almost documentarian in the way that it's going to be pronounced from its subject matter, but it really is done in an artful way. It's special in that regard. I've never seen anything like this movie before.
Yeah, it really caught me off guard because it wasn't what I expected. It grabbed me from the beginning because we're right in there in the experiment, and we see the setup as we're introduced to sort of his team. And I thought, okay, it was taking its time. It was showing us everything, and it got me hooked there. But then as we started altering reality and getting into these other spaces, it really kept me captivated with where we were going with the story. And I thought it was a way to be artful, as you've said, in telling the story, while I think also giving us, for me, it was something engaging to be thinking about as I was watching it, because the substance of the story is really straightforward. There's not a whole lot of plot to keep track of. We're just sort of following, through these key points in his life and in his career as he gains notoriety due to the obedience experiments, and then as he pursues his career in academia and his other experiments that we learn more about. It's really we're getting a fact dump of here's these important events, but we don't have a lot of character arc or story or development going along to keep us engaged. So I think those artful decisions, for me at least, helped keep me engaged and interested in the story that was being presented to me.
And I think that's one of the key sort of beautiful things about this movie. The film that I kept thinking about when I was watching this was A Beautiful Mind, which is told in a completely different way. Yeah. And it obviously deals with some mental illness issues as well. And so it's told in a very creative and beautiful way in that movie. This one doesn't have that kind of character arc, right? The way that they're trying to tell the story, it feels like, I really feel like the writer and director, the one and the same, really appreciated Milgram's story and wanted to treat it with care in the way that it really presents itself to someone who is an objective observer of what he's done, as opposed to where you see late in the film where they make the CBS adaptation of The Experiments and they fictionalize a person of color as being part of the experiments, and they create drama of like having to hold people back from rushing around, like that kind of stuff. So I think that was it came through as something that was an appreciation of the subject matter, and I really respected that from the filmmaker. So
we've Peter Sarsgaard is really our key through this whole story, where he's Stanley Milgram, he's narrating his story, but early on we start to see, we get a cast of familiar faces in this film. Early on we meet his soon-to-be wife, Alexandra Sasha, who is played by Winona Ryder. We have Jim Gaffigan, who's one of the team that's responsible for the experiments. He's the man in the box that's screaming out in pain. We have Anthony we have Anthony Edwards. We have Anton Yelchin. We have John Leguizamo. There were just so many faces.
Cameron Manning.
Yes,
great people.
And just little, maybe just there for a scene or two. It's a large cast with, but a lot of, I want to say, small parts. But there's so much that they have to convey because of the nature of the roles they're playing. Anton Yelchin plays, I believe, the one man who refuses to continue on because he has worked with electricity and he knows what that really feels like.
That was Yelchin. See,
Yes.
with the mustache, I
With the
didn't
mustache.
even recognize
Yes.
him. That makes sense.
And there's, I think, for these actors in just a small amount of time to be able to portray that inner sort of turmoil and strife that people are struggling with. Taryn Manning, she's, when they finally get women to be involved in experiments, she actually turns the box off.
Yeah.
Because she just doesn't want to go any further. And the doctor says, did you turn the machine off? And she sort of is flustered and trying to justify her reasoning. He tells her she must go on. So she starts to, move forward with the next question and answers. And then he prompts her and says, well, you need to turn the box back on. And she,
Right.
There's so much that's conveyed in just minor mannerisms and expressions for each of these people that I think were crucial to this film being successful because of it could so easily, veer off into melodrama or something ridiculous, but it maintains the gravity, I think, because of this cast and keeping things grounded in, serious exploration of human nature.
Yeah, I thought Leguizamo was great, and
yeah.
and for his, I mean, literally, it felt like a cameo. All of the casting, other than Winona Ryder and Peter Sarsgaard, kind of feels like a cameo here. But Sarsgaard was great. He conveyed the perfect mix of dispassion and depth of emotion, which seems like a really subtle thing that I don't think most people would do. But at the same time, I thought he was super internally emotional and externally dispassionate. I bought into it. I thought he did a great job. And I'm not always a huge fan of everything he does, but I thought he was perfect in this role. I thought it was great.
Oh, yeah. There's, as I said, there's a certain coldness to him that I don't know if that's truly what his personality was like. But I think it was very fitting for the way this story was told. And then the dynamics of his relationship with his wife over time, to sort of see how, she's interested in the experiment. And then later on, when it gets to the TV adaptation and he finds himself in a situation where he's really sort of signed over the rights, they're fictionalizing it. So he has no ability to, hold them accountable for being faithful to his experiments because they're now going to fictionalize it. And they have, William Shatner and Ozzie Davis and the made for TV CBS, story of the experiment. And that's where you see the conflict where, she knows how strongly he identifies with that work and how important it is to him. And for him to allow that to be turned into something that she knows is not authentic and an accurate representation. And he's like, hey, I got the money and it's fictional, so it doesn't matter to me and I've got to pay the bills.
Yeah.
Where she seems, much more focused on maintaining the integrity. It's his reputation at stake.
Yeah. And that's that drama is delivered perfectly.
Yeah.
Oh man, there's other people here too. You've got Kellen Lutz.
Oh, it's
which is Emmett from the Twilight movies,
yes.
And he plays Shatner, he doesn't do a Shatner impersonation.
No, he doesn't.
Because you would never expect that. And then Dennis Haysbert, who we just saw as Roland's father
yes.
in the Dark Tower, is Ozzie or Ozzie Davis,
right? Yeah,
the black best friend,
yes.
which is what they called him for the dramatization by CBS. It's a great cast. I've been looking. As we're talking here, I've been looking to try to figure out how or why the cast bought into it, because it's a relatively small film, right?
Yeah.
It's not, the total box office, I think they said, was $128,000 or something like this. I mean, it was tiny, but the movie's great and the cast is amazing. So I'm trying to figure out how everyone bought into it. And, I don't see anything written on the web about it in specific. Do you know anything about it?
No, I think, as we said, a lot of these performances are cameos. It's something they could go in, do in a day and be part of, if you really believe in the power and importance of Milgram's work, to be a part of that and bringing that, story to the screen for people to see and to understand the importance of his work. I think, for a lot of them, I'd be, it's a day or two of work, perhaps to be part. And I think, as I said, a lot of the intensity of these scenes to have something, really meaty to work with, to delve into, to really stretch as an actor and get something like that in such a short scene and be able to pull that off, it's a challenge.
Oh, and okay, the wife of the old professor is Laurie Singer.
Yeah.
From Footloose.
Yes.
Like, wow.
It just keeps going.
Yeah, it's great. So now I'm checking out the cinematographer, right? I'm trying to find, because that's one of the things that's super special in this movie too. My favorite shot of the film is a really weird kind of cutaway scene where Milgram and his professor buddy are standing in shadow, looking out over a hallway in this huge elaborate, it's kind of a window, but it's not painted glass. It's just an elaborate cutout. And the shot is rising up very slowly as they have this conversation in silhouette about the frustrations of trying to get tenure and how bad it is. And his friend then sort of confesses to him that he's going through a divorce after Milgram explains that he thinks that the person who kind of made the decision on his tenure track was going through a divorce. And it just slowly is raising this whole time. And these little camera moves, this really special beauty that you see in this film, it's a really special movie for being so small.
Oh, yeah. And, speaking of, his colleague in tenure, and they talk about the experiment that he conducted, which was sort of that peer pressure experiment, where it's like, which line is longer? And then then Milgram talks about, they recreated this in the 70s. And then we get, sort of, 70s, style, footage of a classroom, kids dressed up like it's 70s. It's like they're recreating within the movie, the experiment to show us, as if, and maybe it is footage of the actual
sometimes
recreation.
They did have the actual footage.
So, and that's where it's hard to tell, because they did such a good job, of the look and feel of, are you recreating something to look like it was shot in the 70s, or is this actual footage of students at the time? I love it. You're so pulled into, and I think, this is, it's the visuals that keep this one going. And I'm looking at the cinematographer, Ryan, it's either Samuel or Samuel. And, it looks like horror films mostly.
Right. And relatively small.
And relatively small horror films, yes.
Great.
Yeah, I think he was given, just some freedom to go. And, and again, working with the director's vision on this of how the tone worked, but I think there was so much strength in the visuals that kept this moving along is really this, that and the performances makes this worth watching.
Yeah, it's a really creative movie.
Yes.
And that's really special considering what most people have to watch today.
Well, yeah. And music, I didn't have anything memorable or noteworthy that struck out to me, but again, that's not one of my strengths when it comes to looking at films, so I didn't know if there was anything in the music that struck you.
The only thing I noticed were the music cues of the familiar songs, the classical stuff that they used, and it didn't seem to necessarily point to anything to me. So it was nondescript for me as well.
So we do look at first shot, last shot, and as I said earlier, our first shot is there in the lab. And so I noted it is a long sort of tracking shot as we have the doctor lead in the two men, and we sort of see the setup for the situation of one's going to be a teacher, one's going to be a learner. And that long shot lasts until we cut to Milgram, who's viewing from behind the two-way mirror. So that's where he spends his time, observing everything. And that's where we get a lot of his commentary. Will he return and talk to the camera to tell us, now's here where it really gets interesting. But our last shot is him in the lab resetting the machine, and he's turning to Sasha, who's in the observation room, and he's just waving to her from the two-way mirror. So he's moved from being the observer to now in the lab.
And I actually want to read the last lines here. They're on IMDb. They do they do this sort of traditional sort of real life wrap up, right? They talk about Sasha, where she lives, and they actually show Sasha in
Yes.
real life
Yes.
participating in an example of one of Stanley's experiments. And then they talk about how the obedience experiments went on and sort of their, ubiquitous nature in culture today. And then the last lines are really interesting for that visual, right? So she's in there in the place where that took place, where the experiment took place. He's looking through the glass at her, and she can't see him, right? Because it's a window on the other side. And he says, "You could say we're puppets, but I believe that we are puppets with perception, with awareness. Sometimes we can see the strings, and perhaps our awareness is the first step in our liberation." And then she does the little wave.
Yeah.
That's really great. I mean, that was really deep. And I don't know if there's necessarily a connection between first shot, last shot, but the interesting thing about the first shot and the scene that's doing everything for the first shot is that it's intercut with with his and her first meeting.
Yes.
So there's a greater story, or greater is the wrong word. There's a through line in this story that is about their relationship. And I think that's really special too. And then talking about his inspiration. There's also one of the things that inspired me in this was at one point he was reading a book by Nabokov, which is actually an autobiography of Nabokov, which was partially fictional and partially autobiographical.
Mm-hmm.
And when Nabokov released it, it was unclear to the world what was true and what was not, which is really interesting when you consider it in relationship to this movie. And he puts out a quote about that. And I've actually added it to my reading list now because that's kind of a special thing. And I feel like that was the frame with which the filmmakers gave us this film. They gave us a bunch of stuff that was accurate and historical with a very artful, dramatic flair that one could say maybe happened, maybe it didn't, but I can guarantee that elephant walking down the hall didn't happen. So, with those pieces, I just think are really special. And I was really affected by the way that they tied this together. Again, the creativity of this film was really special and staggering.
All right. Well, I agree with you. It's why I love doing these trailer rewinds is coming across these little films that aren't high on your they're not high on your radar, but there's little gems there, in these things that make me glad I discovered this film. It's something that I'm going to say, hey, if you're interested in this, and I think, particularly now, as you said, his work is really interesting to look at what it tells us about human nature, behavior. I mean, there's so many other experiments he gets into. I felt like they could have spent more. I wanted more about them, and it sort of left me wanting to go in to say, okay, I know about 6 degrees of separation, but then he was doing other things, the singing on the bus experiment, the familiar stranger experiment of learning that, people at bus stops, that they start to sort of create stories about the strangers around them. Just interesting, stories that I thought it's, given me things to add to my reading list as well. So
right, the nature of us being critical of ourselves when we see ourselves in photographs.
Yes.
I mean, that kind of stuff is really interesting.
So...
Oh, do you think Pete or Andy saw it? They haven't mentioned it.
They haven't mentioned it, and this was one when they talked about it. It was coming out like the following week. I think it was primarily like video on demand release. So I don't know that it made it into theaters much, but I have a feeling this is one that they haven't, because like I said, I don't think there's a big draw for this one. Although Pete was very excited to see Dr. Green, Anthony Edwards, in something again. But again, like I said,
Cameo.
there are familiar faces. There's every reason to see this, but I think it's just not knowing what type of film you're going to get out of this.
And Anthony Edwards was great too. I don't mean to go back, but that's the thing. I actually questioned whether or not it was Anthony Edwards when I saw him.
Oh.
Because I was like, that looks so much like Anthony Edwards, but he was doing something different.
Yes.
And the acting was really special in this film. So I don't think they've seen it either. I think anyone who loves creativity in film and really wants to take a look at something that's an extra level way of storytelling is going to really like this movie. And it's a great Netflix watch.
Definitely. So saying that, where did it end up on your Flick chart when you ranked it?
Oh, so let me jump over to that. So in Flick chart, it was really interesting because it's kind of bland subject matter, to be honest.
It's a challenge.
And all of the wins I was giving it was really just because of how creative it was. So it ends up in a strange place. It definitely got to the top end of my chart, but the second battle that it had was against The Godfather.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't think that there's any way that I can say that this movie is better than that. That being said, it goes over. Now, I like the second Thor movie a lot more than everybody else, but it's above Thor: The Dark World and below The Godfather. So if you eliminate the Thor: The Dark World thing, then the next one down is Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?
Oh, okay.
Which I think is actually kind of, that's where it kind of makes sense, right? You're telling a story in a new artful way, and I think that's a perfect place for it to be. So that's number 70 out of 154.
Okay. See, I had a challenge just right off the start with this because it went up against Get Out. And
sure.
And so, another, strong. So I couldn't put it over Get Out.
That's a terrible one to have in the middle for you.
It is. So it got condemned to the bottom half because of that. I said, I feel like this should be higher. But yeah, Get Out being there right in the middle is right now
polarizing.
Yes, exactly. And it was interesting because I looked at both these saying, they're telling us so much about human nature and society. But for me, Get Out was far more entertaining. So it stumbled around in the bottom and it ended up, and this was really interesting, ended up just below Comet.
Okay.
And then
another one that we did
another
in our
one,
trailer.
and then so that it's just below Comet and just above Terrence Malick's To the Wonder, which I had also seen on Netflix. So it's 209 out of 267. Yeah. So I feel like it deserves to be higher because of the artfulness, but the story, it's one where I think if I'm going to watch it, I'm going to watch sequences for the visuals in them.
Right.
But the story, again, I got the information that I needed out of it. There's not a lot to draw me back in to take. I don't have an emotional reaction to this film. It's more of an intellectual reaction to the film.
Yep. Yeah. And now that being said, I will actually give it a pretty high ranking on Letterboxd because of everything they did from a filmmaking standpoint on this one. So I would actually give it probably like a 4-star rating, even though I can't literally compare it to those really sort of dramatic masterpieces that are out there. But as far as entertainment value, but I'm really happy that this film was made, and I'm really happy that we chose it for this. So I give it 4 stars.
See, I'm close. I'm right at 3.5 stars on that because sure. I can't let this film be overlooked. I want to share it with people, but warn them ahead of time. You're going to enjoy this one time, and but that's probably
that's
probably about it. But it's something that I really enjoyed, and it's again another one of those pleasant surprises.
Cool. Yeah, I think that's special. I think it's like you said, YouTube clips to show the special visuals, and then potentially some of the cool quotes as well.
All right. Well, I'm going to wrap us up here. If you haven't already, everybody out there listening, give us a rating and review on iTunes. It helps other film fans discover us, just as we're discovering these little gems of films. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and even better, you can help The Next Reel by supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com, The Next Reel. A reward was just added, the Saturday Matinee, which is a new weekly short exclusive to Patreon supporters. But the best thing you can do is go watch a movie with a friend and sit down and have a conversation about it. And if it's one of the films that we've discussed on any of our shows, let us know about it. We love hearing from you. Hondo.
Good night, Steve.
Good night.